Dan Poblacki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with creators currently working in the genre. I can still remember the first time I watched the film that is the basis for today's chat, Mary Lambert's 1989 film version of Stephen King's novel, Pet Sematary. The movie stars Dale Midkiff, Denise Crosby, Brad Greenquist, Miko Hughes, Blaise Burdall, and Fred Gwynne. So much of this story has stuck in my brain, and so much of it is still very, very scary. Haunted graveyards, killer trucks, resurrected cats, zombie children, and especially Zelda, the troubled sister of our protagonist's thanatophobic wife. But today's guest, Joe Vallese, who chose this film as one of his first fears, will agree when I say that what's scary about it now is not necessarily what was scary about it then, at least not to our adult selves. And that is what makes this conversation particularly interesting to me. Joe Vallese is a Pushcart-nominated essayist, a professor, and editor, most recently of the nonfiction anthology It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, with essays contributed by Carmen Maria Machado, Zephyr Lisowski, and many other brilliant queer horror enthusiasts and cultural critics. It's a really wonderful collection, one of my favorites of this year, and I hope you pick up a copy. A couple strange coincidences about today's episode. First, today is the 1-year anniversary of It Came from the Closet's release, which I did not plan. Second, when Joe and I first had this conversation, I was totally unaware that another Pet Sematary film was on its way. This one a prequel. And wouldn't you know, Pet Sematary Bloodlines comes out this Friday, October 6th, 2023, on Paramount+. I, for one, am intrigued and slightly nervous. Looks like the stars have aligned for us this week, hopefully in a good way. I've decided to put the content warnings in the show notes, so if you like, check those out before listening. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hi there, Joey Vallese.
Hi, Dan. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and talk about your first fears with me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a special conversation.
Yeah, this you chose Pet Sematary, and I have to admit that I've watched this one a lot, and yeah. I'm a big horror fan. And for some reason, when I pressed play last night in the rewatch review, this sense of dread settled in, and yeah. I got scared, and I was like, remembering everything that was about to like hit me, I was like, oh my God, putting myself through this again. So I think this will be an interesting conversation.
It's really scary. It's a really effective film. I think it holds up really, really well. And you know what that means in terms of like what it means to hold up in that way, right? Like, is it because that the themes and the concepts and the imagery is so timeless, or is it something else that's so like kind of effective and gets under the skin? Maybe just like the fact that it's one of the strongest Stephen King stories as a whole, right? And so that plays a role. But yeah, no, I'm totally with you. When I had a rewatch, it's kind of one of those things. I chose it in part because I can access it in my mind so easily. Mm-hmm. It sort of overlaps with the question of like, what were the first things that scare you, because it is one of my early moments of being really scared. And there are multiple moments in the film that made me so scared as a kid. And so I think that they're sort of indelible, and they stick to my brain and my imagination in so many ways. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah. So to start off, before we get into the film itself, would you mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself, maybe about your work, if you like, and your relationship to the horror genre?
Absolutely. So I'm clinical associate professor at NYU. I teach writing, mostly to first years and international students. We do personal and critical essay, but I always find a way to insert horror into the class. And I like to scare my students early on. As a long ago, I came up with a sort of an assignment to scare them and to think about surprise and exhilaration and the things that you read, and like how we separate like what we're literally seeing from what the implications are. I do that with a scene from Ty West's The House of the Devil, which I think you and I watched together many years ago.
Favorite. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my favorite Ty West movie. I know he's getting a lot of well-deserved praise for Pearl and X, and that trilogy is really fun, but I don't think he's ever done it as well as he did it the first time, which I mean as a compliment to him. He might not take it that way if he ever hears this. But I think it's like such a special movie. I know lots of people who just think it's so boring, and I'm like,
Oh no.
you just don't get it. You're not
No.
in the space. It's a perfect little movie. And I love that Greta Gerwig is in it, because I think it's going to find new viewers now as a result of that. They're going to go back and be like, wait, she was in a horror movie?
I
right?
was just about to say Greta Gerwig is in that movie, and
she's really good in it.
She meets
so
a very shocking
it's such a scary
fate.
scene. Yeah, it's scary, and she just plays that role of like the sort of ditzy friend who's not so ditzy because she is the only one who says a smart thing. Like she tries to like stop and interrupt the sort of slasher trope from unfolding, but she doesn't get very far. Spoiler. But yeah, it's so I show that to students to like say like there's a scene where she gets up, her pizza tastes bad, she's watching a scary movie, she throws the pizza away, makes a face, drinks some water, and then starts to walk through the house, and then she hears the faucet go on, and then she walks up the stairs very slowly, and then her like just all this like great silhouette work, and it's totally silent, and then she finds the hair in the sink, and then the door is opening upstairs. And so students have so many questions because they're like, wait, why is she going through the house? Like if she doesn't think somebody should be there, why is she going up? And that leads to like, well, maybe she knows she's not alone, so what does that change about her perspective, and what do we? And so I stop it right before it gets really scary, right before the ending, when she sort of opens the door, or the door opens and she's starting to get very faint, and I stop it there. And so we think about, and then I tell them there's been 90 minutes before that you haven't seen, this is the very end, and they're like, what? And then they get really into like trying to figure out like what's going on, and we separate sort of the composition of the scene from the story, right? Like, so they're two different things, they come together eventually, but let's talk about them separately. So I use scary stuff in class in a very modest way. That's one of the things that I do.
I love that.
Yeah, just to rewind, but so it's always followed me, and I'm the editor of It Came From the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, which came out last October on Feminist Press and was just reissued with a new foreword and a new essay by Sarah Bound Books in the UK and Ireland.
Awesome!
It just happened in June. Yeah, it was really exciting. I got to
great.
go to London for the launch and do a big event, and it was awesome. And so.
I was telling you just before we started recording that I think it's a very special book, and it's one of my favorites that I've read this year.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it kind of in a way sort of reflects kind of what I'm doing here, like asking people to come and talk about a project, a horror piece.
Yeah.
And your collection is filled with some really insightful, very clever and creative writing, and including your own essays.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah. So it's 25 queer and trans writers, myself included, writing about a horror film, like one specific film that changed them, shaped them, like has something to do with their queer identity. And the prompt was open, so it could mean different things to different writers. The only thing was you had to choose one film. Although some of the essays cheat a little bit and lean on a few movies, but overall it's just this really fascinating, really diverse collection that I think surprises a lot of people. I get a lot of like, I can't believe there's no Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, and I'm like, there's a whole documentary on that. There's so many things written about that. Like, I don't want that. So instead, I chose one about the original movie that is completely a crazy experimental essay.
Yes, brilliant.
About mental illness and trans identity, and it's so good. And so there's so many, it touches on parenthood and loss and art and love and sex and grief, and it just does so many surprising things with the movie. So I'm really very proud of it. And there's a great essay on Pet Sematary in there. It's a Pet Sematary / The Ring. It's a brilliant trans writer named Zephyr Lazowski who writes about those two films and focuses on Samara from The Ring and Zelda from Pet Sematary, and sort of how disability is made to be so monstrous in those movies. and it's just a brilliant, brilliant essay. So that came out in October, and it's sort of a lifetime in the making because I grew up watching horror movies, quite literally raised on them. My dad is a huge horror nut, like so much that we would go to the movie theater, go to the video store rather, and we belonged to multiple. Partly because my brothers used to not return the tapes, and then my dad would have to just join a new one. This is what life was like in the '90s, everybody.
Oh
If you
yeah.
want, like, because they wanted to charge you $1,000 for a video if you were late. So my dad would just be like, "God damn it, keep it," and then he would go join another one, like another town. And so we went to so many video stores, and we got to a point where my dad was repeating movies. Like we'd be like, "Dad, is this a German movie? There's no subtitles." Like, yeah, but I can kind of follow it along. And then we realized he'd seen it already. And we're like, wow, we've rented everything. So
Wow.
that's how into horror my dad was. And I was the youngest. I am the youngest of four. So I had older siblings. So I was watching these movies probably as young as 5 or 6. And my eldest brother is 9 years older than me, so he was really excellent at like shielding my eyes during scenes that he
Mm.
thought would scare me too much, or too sexual. Like he was good about looking out for me to make sure that I didn't like leave the experience afraid. I don't think he realized he was even doing it,
Hmm.
but he definitely was like caretaking in that way. And also I didn't want to spoil it for everybody else, so I had to put on the big boy pants and watch whatever they were watching. Otherwise
Right.
they'd have to turn it off. And I was watching these, and then would go put on, Follow That Bird or whatever, the Sesame Street movie with the blue big bird, which is
Yes.
scary in its own way. And and I
Jim Henson always had a way to like.
yeah,
There was a darkness in Jim Henson that a
totally,
lot of people
totally. And I
don't
watched
recognize.
no, not at all. And I watched Pinocchio a lot, and that's really scary. So we watched horror movies all the time, and I loved them. But there was always the occasional moment where I got trapped. When I say trapped, it means we went to the movie theater, and we
Mm.
couldn't leave the movie theater because it was expensive, right? Even then, to take 4 kids to the movies, and I had to stay. So they always wanted to make sure that I wanted to really go to the movies with them, and I always would. But the movie theater is just a different environment. Even though we'd walk out, I mean, like the saving grace is we would go to like an early matinee because it was so
Hmm.
much cheaper and easier to take everybody on like a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning. I would come out to brightness, and it would like sort of like the light would like train my brain not to be afraid, and then
Yeah.
it would all be okay.
It's
And so
interesting.
that's the way I sort of like went through childhood watching these movies, never being like super traumatized or too afraid of anything. A few movies did it to me, but Pet Sematary was like maybe the first movie I remember having to like get up and like stand in the lobby of the theater with the door cracked so I didn't miss what was happening because I cared about the
Wow.
story and I didn't want to miss it. But I remember telling my dad that I had to go and stand. And I did, and I watched through like a crack in the door, and like just people walking past me and stuff made me feel like, okay, it was a good reminder that it was a movie and it was in like a box in front of
Hmm.
me. And so that
Yeah.
was really
Our
useful.
our childhood brains figure out ways for us to be able to get through these moments.
Totally.
How old were you when you saw that in the theater?
It was when it was in theaters, so I was 7, or maybe about to be 7. It depends when it came out. I would have turned 7 in September, so maybe I was 6 going on 7. But
So,
yeah,
yeah. So I'm wondering, with all of these horror movies that you saw at a young age, if seeing all of these horror movies at a young age has something to do with what I'm going to ask you next, and it's
yeah.
something I'm asking all of the guests, and it's: do you recall the first time you ever felt frightened?
So the funny thing about that is that it wasn't a horror movie that frightened me. It was the reason why I am a very poor swimmer who every few years gets into the idea that I'm gonna like go get adult swim lessons again. And now I really have to because I have a son who loves the water, so I have to like go and brush up. But I remember the first time being afraid really viscerally, and like in my bones, and it was like being on like the beach at the Jersey Shore and like being brought to like right to the water, and like a really scary tide coming in, and it feels, nobody seems to remember it, but I remember it like it was yesterday, and my body remembers it, and I remember it just being really, really, really tall. Like, so I was probably like 4 or 5, and it just sort of consumed me and brought me into the water. And
Mm.
somebody probably grabbed me like 3 seconds later, but I remember being like truly frightened in my like guts, like I'm gonna die now, and being pulled into the water and being really scared. And it sort of like put me on a trajectory of like being like having a really difficult relationship with water, and sort of like not believing that my body can do the work of keeping myself afloat. And
Mm,
just like I get anxiety even talking about it right now, even though like we'll
mm.
go on vacation, I'll be in a pool, like I will go into the water like quite a bit, and not and trying to freak myself out. But like as I get older, I won't like let myself float on my back, and I won't like,
Mm.
even though I did at some point learn how to swim,
And
but I was so
floating on your
bad at
back
it.
is one of the best ways to sort of, if you are ever in peril, to sort of keep yourself alive.
Totally. Yeah. And so I know how to do it, and I've done it, and it's a good instinct. And I think if like forced, I'd be able to do it all right. But then becomes combined with like I wear glasses. I don't see very well. So like
Mm,
having, not being able to have my glasses in the water is like a stressful thing. And, I have asthma. So like getting short of breath in the water gets scary. And there was like a period in my life where I like had the confidence and like learned how to swim, and we joined the town pool that summer, and I was in the water a ton, and I became less afraid of it. And that sort of like comes and goes. And I believe like in my soul I can also I can probably do it again and get there again, and I
mhm.
want to, and I think I need to try. But that's my first true memory of being truly afraid. Like,
It's
yeah, nothing to do with the horror movies,
it's
but a
I
different
mean
kind of fear.
it's a moment where you were traumatized, and
Yeah.
I get that. I in my own experience with water, like my family grew up on a lake in Massachusetts, my
Mm-hmm.
extended family at least. So we were thrown into dark lake water at a very young age.
Oh God.
Um, Learned how to swim. My brother, my sister, and I were all on the swim team. And maybe it was spending so much time face down in the water, doing laps, doing freestyle, hours and hours as a kid. I ended up hating it. A lot of nightmares I've ended up having in my adult life have had to do with swimming pools.
Yeah.
The deep end of the pool, there's something in the dark. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't ever a question of could I swim, could I survive. It was like, what is underneath me, what is
Yeah.
going to chomp at my feet, what is going to pull me down into the depths. And of course, like, it's a swimming pool, that's not possible. So it's this very
Right.
strange irrational fear, but I think it has to do with my time on the swim team and really not liking it.
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
I also feel like the ocean. I mean, and there's lots
Mm,
of good reasons to back me up, but it feels like outer space on Earth,
mhm,
and there are who knows what is under there. It's just really, when you just look at like the vastness and like the endlessness of the water, it's just really messes with my head. It's like one of the, it's like staring at the sky for too long, and then like
mm,
imagining galaxies and aliens and
yeah.
planets. And I love alien movies, even though that like really freaks me out too, like the concept of space, and
Mhm,
or something coming out of the sky all of a sudden. But the ocean feels like it is all of those things at once, right? Like it's not
absolutely.
it's not up, but it's out, and it's under, and it's just like, yeah, all of it. So even though I can like really appreciate like being on a beach and like a tropical vacation and like the Jersey Shore and all that, and I'm a Jersey boy,
Yeah.
so I enjoy that, conceptually, and the familiarity of it. But yeah, just being in the water is a very different story.
Well, I think there's a great mystery there, right? There's a great
Yeah,
mystery of like what we can't see, what is just beyond our reach, what is out there in the vastness of vastnesses.
totally.
And I think that kind of can lead us into the discussion of this movie a little bit. What is beyond, Pet Sematary is a 1989 film directed by Mary Lambert, written by Stephen King based on his book. For the listeners, do you mind giving a brief description of the film so people can sort of get a sense of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pet Cemetery is about a doctor named Lewis Creed. He and his family moved from Chicago to Maine, of course, and he has a wife, Rachel, and they have two children, Ellie and Gage. Side note, my sister-in-law's sister gave her son the middle name Gage because she and her husband loved the name from Pet Cemetery. And I was like, that's so
No.
creepy.
Unbelievable. I As a side note, also, I met a child at an event
Uh-huh.
some time ago, and signing a book to them, their name was Gage, and I
Wild.
stupidly said to them, "Oh, do you know where your name is from? This is like an 8-year-old, and the
Yeah.
parents sort of like turned beet red behind him. And I was like, oops. Well, I'm not going to tell you, kids. So,
My sister named her son Leland after Leland Palmer from Twin Peaks, which is also a complicated.
Oh my
She doesn't think
God.
about it that way. She just loved
Yeah.
the name, but I'm like,
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt. So the Creeds move to a small town in Maine, and they have a very creepy cat named Church. I'm not a cat guy. I know you are. And Church is very, very creepy.
The
And
creepiest.
Church dies, and the kids are distraught. They have a neighbor named Judd Crandall who tells them all about the pet cemetery, which I
Out in
believe,
the woods.
out in the woods in a problematic fashion is, it was like an Indian burial ground or something that that Stephen King might not even mess with anymore and would think of an alternative to. And, it says things, you bury something there and it comes back to life. But he sort of he tells him about it, but in like funny film fashion, like doesn't necessarily like initially warn him not to do anything about it, right? And then so the cat gets buried and the cat comes back, and the cat comes back very bad.
It's very stinky.
Perhaps evil and stinky, yeah, and just dead. And then truly, distressing and heartbreaking. There are going to be spoilers on this for anybody who's listening to it, obviously.
Spoilers
but,
to everybody who hasn't seen
yeah,
Pet Sematary.
they live off of a very, very like it would seem like a desolate road, but like big trucks come through all the time, and we get like a very stressful foreshadowing of like a big truck ripping through all of a sudden. And Gage, who I believe is 2 or 3, gets hit by a truck. I mean, terrible and very, very stressful, and something that you don't see very much in movies for good reason, and is killed. And the grief is so overwhelming that Lewis makes the mistake of burying Gage. As Judd wisely says to him, sometimes dead is better. But he doesn't listen, and little Gage comes back.
He says
and
it 3 times too. I noticed last night. He says,
"Yeah,
sometimes dead is better."
that actor is
his
amazing.
main accent.
he was the judge in My Cousin Vinny. He's so good in that too.
He played Herman Munster.
Yes, that's right. Of course, I always forget that.
He's brilliant in this movie.
He's incredible. He's so like
he's your old man Mainer guy.
No, he's amazing and very, very memorable. Yeah, and so that sets the course of the film, and we also get interesting backstory on Rachel's sister Zelda. And so it goes back to her childhood trauma, and Zelda is one of the scariest. Zelda is what scared me. And made me leave the theater. And
I think you're one of many who agree, who believe
totally.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the
Did
movie...
you mention that Lewis Creed, the dad, ends up burying Gage in the pet cemetery?
Yes.
You did. Yeah, you did mention that. Okay.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. But we'll repeat it again if we need to. He doesn't listen to Judd, and he buries Gage, and Gage comes back. Well, that's the funny thing about it. It's like you watch it and you're like, how could he think that anything good would come of it, or that his son would return as his son based on what Judd has told him and based on what they saw with the cat. He's also visited by like the ghost of this young guy on a bike who gets killed and comes into the emergency room, and so there's sort of this
Lewis is a doctor at the local college. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes. And so go ahead.
Yeah, so Lewis is a doctor at the local college. This young man, a runner or a bicyclist, is hit by one of those trucks in a foreshadowing way. His name is Victor Pascal, and he dies right in front of Lewis Creed, but not before giving Lewis a very dire warning that is mysterious, and Lewis isn't quite sure what to make of it. And so Victor keeps appearing as a spirit to sort of warn Lewis about not going to the burial ground and participating in the magic that happens there. That's what the Victor Pascal character does. And I do want to talk about him later, because in this rewatch, I had some realizations about him.
Oh, cool. I'm excited to hear that. And also, I think I think structurally, it's a very interesting. Novels can get away with structures like this, but film, it's a little bit tricky because the burial and resurrection of Gage happens quite late in the movie, right? In terms of like because you can't have it go on for too long, so it happens closer to the end, and like a lot happens in the ending, and it's a very interesting, like, not that there's dead space in the movie because it's a pretty short film, and Mary Lambert was a video director. She directed Madonna's Like a Prayer video.
She did?
um oh yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
didn't
yeah.
know that. Oh my
Yeah,
God,
no,
guys.
yeah, which makes a lot of sense after you, right? Like when you think about it, you're like, wait a second, now I can see it. So there's something about the pacing of it, or like the visuals of it, that sort of allow for that type of like structure to unfold and not feel unusual or feel, but like the body, or like the middle of the film, I think is then given quite a bit to like
Breathe.
Rachel's reckoning with
Yeah.
Zelda, and that's
It's
all very scary too. And yeah.
I see what you're talking about. When I was watching it last night, I was like, there are horror movies that are suspense horror movies, and there are
Hmm.
horror movies that are existential horror movies. This
Yeah.
is an existential horror movie, and I think the structure lends the fact that it is existential horror lends itself to the kind of structure that it has, in
Yeah.
that it's slow. Pieces of the plot are stacked one on top of the other until all of it adds up to something in the end. Rachel, the wife's flashbacks about her sister Zelda are important early on because it gives a sense of why she is behaving the way she's behaving
Hmm.
regarding death, the death of Victor
Hmm.
Pascal. She's so upset about that. She
Hmm.
doesn't want to talk about death with her daughter Ellie, who is very concerned about,
Yep.
what happens to us afterwards, which is, I think, the crux of this film. So all of that sort of character stuff sort of leads up to what happens in Judd's house at the end after Gage comes back and starts
Right.
wrecking havoc. You're right. It's an interesting format, and I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but
No, no, no.
yeah.
Well, and I think that they allow it to unspool that way because it was written by Stephen King for the screen. So you are not going to mess with his screenplay, which is a pretty faithful adaptation. Because even though it scared me so much, I, of course, wanted to immediately read the book. And so I did that. So I was like 7 or 8 reading the
Oh
book,
my
which
God,
is,
Joey,
well,
what?
because I used to love reading. No, I read Misery. I read Needful Things, which I really love. It's maybe my favorite. And it just, no, I loved reading Stephen King. We have the same birthday, so I always felt like cosmically connected to him.
Ooh, yes, of course you
Um,
are. Yeah.
yeah. And so but I felt okay reading like, because I'd seen the film, reading the book felt like I could then, sort of imagine what the characters and the actors from the movie and the book, and I could see where it was different, but it was a pretty good adaptation. I think it's probably a good rationale for having novelists write their own
Hmm.
versions of their screenplays, even if they need doctoring or some help by somebody who knows how to structure the 3 acts of a film. But I feel like they let him condense it in a way that made sense to his mind, and it plays out that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're totally right. It sort of has, it's more the existential dread of it, and the big questions are definitely more sophisticated than like
Hmm.
one might think. If you watch
Hmm.
it, you can see all the ways that it's a goofy 80s horror
Hmm.
movie,
Hmm.
but I think it's just really still very, very effective. And I think it's because of what you described, that it is asking these big questions that are not really, some of them can be answered, like
Hmm.
sometimes dead is better is a great thesis for a movie, and it's kind of exciting that it gets said so explicitly.
Hmm.
And I think it's the tagline too, so they really beat you over the head with it. But
I don't know if
um,
you listen to the King Cast. Have you ever listened to that? It's
no, I
Fangoria
haven't.
production. It's one of my favorites. The King Cast, their opening credits start with Judd Crandall's voiceover. Sometimes dead is better, and it's something I look forward to every time I listen to that podcast. But speaking of big questions,
Yeah.
I sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the discussion between Lewis, the doctor, and his wife Rachel, the mom, talking about death and teaching kids about death regarding Church, the cat, who is about to go and get his nuts chopped, according to the laundry person who comes in and
Hmm.
teaches Ellie this terminology, nuts chopped, and Ellie's worried that something might happen to church, and it puts something in her head about like, what do I do if my cat dies? And foolishly, Rachel insists that Lewis promises her that nothing will happen to the cat. And I think it says a lot about Rachel's character from the very beginning, how she's very unwilling to talk about death, to confront death. But the idea of teaching kids about death is definitely a big question. And I think, in a way, when I was a kid, so I came to this movie, I think I was 12, and I did not see it in the theater.
Right.
But when I watched it, I do feel like it started to raise a lot of questions in my own childhood mind. And the questions of death, like, how do you talk to children about death? I feel like this movie talked to me about many, many things about death, and maybe raised more questions in my little kid brain than I needed to have those questions there. But I found this film when my family was on a vacation. My brother and I were staying in a separate room in a motel from my parents, and we begged them. We were like, can we watch Pet Sematary? Can we rent Pet Sematary on the motel's rental service? And my parents had started to let us watch horror movies. My dad was pretty strict about the things that we digested back then, but I think I had just seen The Lost Boys, and some other things started coming up, and I was a huge fan of Fangoria magazine, and I really liked the special effects pictures, the images of how did they make this gore happen. And what happens to Judd Crandall's face was centered very clearly in those Fangoria pictorials. And so I was very curious.
Very, very clearly, actually.
Yeah. I mean, what happens to Judd is absolutely bonkers. Like, in a way that I think is as iconic as the Zelda character is to a lot of people. What happens to Judd's Achilles heel, and then to his face, and then his neck. All of that was sort of spelled out in the Fangoria magazines. And so I wanted to see this movie. And so I watched it with my brother alone in a hotel room somewhere, maybe between New Jersey and Florida, on a long drive. And that was my introduction to Pet Sematary. And then I too went out and got the book immediately as a 12-year-old and read it. It freaked me out. Of course, it freaked me out. It did all of the things that it was supposed to do. But I think my 12-year-old brain, I was more concentrating on the gore. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so gory. I wasn't thinking about the questions of like a father digging his son up out of the grave and then cradling him while weeping there. Like that stuff went over my head. But that's the stuff that I think the movie is really all about, that grief, that death, the ideas, those big ideas. And I wonder if that's a lot of young people's experience with this film. It's like the first time that they were actually confronted with some very big, scary questions.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely onto something. You know, it's funny because I was like a little bit, though I suggested the movie, I was a little bit reluctant to revisit it now that I'm a dad, and I, sort of, but what it did was it actually instead transported me back. It brings me back to a lot of my original feelings watching it. It's one of those films that still centers me back in a place where I was when I was first, and maybe not even just the first time, but like, because I was also a kid who rewatched things a million times if I liked it, even if it scared me. And this was one of them. So I would rewatch it. But what it did was it sort of recentered my experience of being a kid. And what it did was make me think as a little boy, like the idea that you or I at 7, 6 years old, 8 years old could also die. And so for me, it feels like, because we didn't really see that in horror movies, and not only could I get hit by this big truck and be killed, but then maybe also somebody without my consent could bury me and make me come back, but make me come back in a way that a version of myself that wasn't me. And that was very scary too, because I was also, my dad's the best, but like, I definitely also watched The Exorcist around that age too, which is so scary for precisely the same reasons.
Hmm.
Of course, we were super Catholic then,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so that also played into it, and sort of the fear of God was also, the fear of God, but also like the iconography of Jesus is so scary, and like, I definitely had, sort of waking nightmares, waking up and seeing like a Jesus statue at the foot of the bed with, his hands out, and like
Yeah.
that was terrifying. And I feel like I might have actually seen Exorcist 3 Legion on TV before I saw The Exorcist, and that's a really scary movie. I actually rewatched it just a few weeks ago after I saw the terrible trailer for the new David Gordon Green sequel. I was like, I need a palate cleanser. I'm going to watch Legion. It's so good. It's so good. It's so scary. It's a great story. No, also written and directed by William Peter Blatty, who got to write and direct his own novel as a script. So again, has an interesting structure, and so I'm really into that right
I
now. This like,
I
yeah,
know that if somebody doesn't choose Exorcist 3 to come and talk to me on
I'll
this
be back.
podcast about, I mean, we certainly can do that. I was going to say I'm
I'll
going
come
to do
back
it by
for it.
myself because
No, I'll come back. It's so
that one
good.
messed me up. And there's that one
Yeah,
scene, and I know you know what I'm talking about because
everybody.
it
It's yeah.
is the scariest thing I've ever seen.
I remembered the payoff of that scene more than I remembered the entirety of the scene. And
Mhm.
when I rewatched it
It's
last week or 2
so
weeks ago,
long.
it goes on for so long, and the distance of the shot is
Yeah.
so stressful.
Yeah.
Being so far away,
Yeah.
it's like a brilliant. He was a brilliant director. He did such a great job. It like is so, it does something so different than the original movie, but it does something equally effective in like, because there's intimacy to like being close up on Reagan, and what's happening to her. That's really scary, but this sort of does the opposite and zooms out,
Mhm.
and it's just it's such an inventive story too. Like it's
Yeah.
really great. It's a really, yeah, so that's going off to a different
No,
separate
no.
thing, but
This is something
yeah,
that keeps coming up on the podcast with other conversations, and I don't know
yeah,
if it's speaking about horror films or horror projects from the 80s, but
yeah,
religious horror is very common topic in these conversations that I've been
yeah,
having, and I wouldn't put Pet Cemetery outside of that realm either.
no, no, totally, I agree. It's
Yeah.
absolutely, because it does it without
It's about resurrection, and
yeah,
who
exactly,
is the
it
most
doesn't
famous resurrected person, you
totally,
know? It's like
totally,
it's the
and
corruption of the Christ
absolutely.
idea.
Absolutely. Even cemetery is spelled incorrectly. There's something
Yes.
satanic about the spelling of it. And it's no, I agree with you. And it doesn't like have to insert Christianity explicitly to make it about that as well. I mean, listen, the perversity of the grandfather attacking the father who just lost his child and blaming him for his death, and then
In the church.
the right, and the casket opening, and it's like that's every bit as like perverse and blasphemous and stressful and full of a million question marks as anything in The Exorcist. Like it fits
Mhm.
that, right? It fits that same kind of, if we're thinking of like a realm where like these kinds of images live together in the horror genre, it's there with it. And so it absolutely overlaps, even though it doesn't have to explicitly make it about that. So thinking about myself and the stress and the questions that it opened about Gage's death and his resurrection and his behavior, because also this is like around the time too, I think the year before Child's Play came out, so you have a killer doll, and the original Child's Play is actually a really scary movie.
Oh yeah.
It's really excellent to have sort of that like perversion of a childlike thing, which 80s movies did a lot. And then when we go into Rachel's sister Zelda,
Mhm.
who was dying before her eyes, I forget, do they explicitly name what she has, or is it just like an
Yes.
invented?
I have a whole thing about this.
Okay, I don't want to jump ahead, but
No, no,
before
no,
you
like
get
we
there,
we can
yeah.
we can do it now.
Well,
Um,
so the fact that
yeah.
Rachel has to witness her sister's death in such a way, like, so that trauma for her, witnessing death, but not only witnessing death, wishing for death, and that's a
Mm.
really important thing that she owns up to in her conversation. Like she
Mhm.
wants Zelda to die. She wants
Yeah.
her to be gone,
And
and then
when
she
she
gets her
does,
wish.
it runs
Right?
off
It's
laughing,
so it runs. I
possibly
mean,
laughing.
it's and we can certainly speak to what's problematic about having like a grown man play a teenage girl, and then right, but the remake uses an actual young girl, and it's not scary or effective at all, in
Mm.
my opinion. So there is something like special about that. But to me, it is the exaggeration and the mental hyperbole that
Yeah.
Rachel's trauma makes her witness Zelda in this way, even though she's
Okay.
a teenage girl, right?
That's good, because I have two issues
Yeah.
with the
Go.
Zelda character. Super effective as a scare, super
Yeah,
effective as an image, but I never understood, because it is mentioned quite a lot in Stephen King's novel, and also at least once or twice in the film, that she is suffering from spinal meningitis,
that's right. That's right.
right?
That's right.
And on a personal level, like for me, experiencing this film as a kid, one of our family friends, their mother passed away from spinal meningitis. And it was nothing like what is depicted on the screen or even in Stephen King's book. And
Right.
that sort of, for a while, it sort of marked this as a weakness in the storytelling. But I think I was trying to figure out. I was looking up other people's opinions about this, and somebody mentioned Rachel as a possible unreliable narrator,
Mm,
right? And her memory not necessarily being what actually happened, which makes
yeah,
sense.
makes a
As
lot of sense.
as kids, when we're going through something extremely traumatic and fearful, maybe Rachel misremembered the diagnosis. Maybe Zelda never did any of these things, like didn't threaten her or make her feel like it, whatever it was. I think it's easier for me to reconcile what I see as a plot problem
Hmm.
as maybe like a purposeful idea of a child remembering death incorrectly.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, first of all,
I mean,
the
that's a, yeah.
depiction of somebody going through a serious illness as a horror villain. I think Zelda is an effective tool to give us a scare, but I didn't want it to seem like an insensitive move on the artists, the creators, the filmmakers, the writers' part. And
Hmm.
I think if I can reconcile that, maybe this is a case of unreliable narrator, a misremembering, it's easier for me to digest this part of the film. Like, what do you think about that?
I really like, so I'll say a few things. First, fun fact is I had viral meningitis when I was a kid.
Oh, wow.
Um, and, it's the least lethal, but it was very
Yeah.
scary. And I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
again, around the same age. And I think it's part of the reason why I never, even though I just rewatched it, I never remember the meningitis conversation, because I don't like associate that in my mind at all as like, because I know that's not. And also, actual meningitis kills people very quickly. It's not
Yeah.
a,
Like
like,
24
that's what's
hours
so
or less.
scary about it. You die so quickly from it. So I wonder if it was one of those things where, like, the book was written so long ago, and I wonder if it was like one of those things that it just sounded like a scary thing that people didn't really know anybody who had. So Stephen King just took liberty with it. It's kind of shocking that nobody, like, you have script supervisors, you have all these people who are involved. Nobody said, "Wait a second, I don't think that's what happens. Why don't you just change it, to MS or something like that?" Or, because I
Literally,
had
like
a
cancer,
my
anything.
yeah, it's very it's really strange. It feels like just like a mistake, and I haven't read the book since I was a kid, so I don't know if it's in the novel,
It
right?
is.
Or if it so yeah, so it's very strange that kind of, or maybe we just lived in a time where you could just like make up what an illness did to somebody, back then, and now we just can't do it now because we have all this information shared, and
Mhm.
it's so easy to disprove. And I have only seen the remake once, so I don't know if they call it that in the remake. Maybe they fixed it in the remake. I don't
I
know.
don't. I think they
Um,
actually do it in the remake too, which is I
which
just
is also crazy if the
I'm like
character is a doctor, and it's like, but I'm with you on that. It's an annoying thing that mars and otherwise interesting, but I find that the Zelda memory in the show, I think it works on multiple levels. I think, one, it speaks to the sort of interesting relationship that Rachel has with death. And also, I wonder if there's something at work. One of the things that both movies fail to do is bring up the Wendigo as part of the
mhm,
myth,
mhm,
and that the
mhm.
Wendigo is what is doing this to the characters, and what is,
From the
you
novel.
know, Right. And Wendigos are a very creepy concept. And I don't know a lot about it because it's actually one of those things that, like, when I think about it, really weirds me out. I don't know if you know a lot about Wendigos, and you
Yeah.
can give a summary for the listener. But
From what I mean, I've
it
talked about a
yeah.
Wendigo on another episode. I was talking with my friend Anika about scary stories to tell in the dark, and there's a story in that book
Mm,
called The Wendigo.
yeah.
And I don't believe Alvin Schwartz got the folklore, the Native American folklore correct in that.
I'm
And
sure he didn't.
the, so what I understand as a Wendigo spirit is a kind of evil entity that sort of affects people out in the woods, in the wilderness, who are starving. And it sort of takes over their bodies, their brains, and turns them into ravenous beings that will
Hmm.
consume any kind of flesh because their hunger is never satiated.
Yeah.
That's what I know of a Wendigo. I might be wrong.
Well, no, I think you're right, and I think maybe like a manipulation, maybe problematic manipulation of that lore for Stephen King, and maybe that's why it never carried over it more like explicitly into the movies. Like,
Yeah.
there's the remake has a drawing of one, and that's it. But I think that the movies also expand this idea that's supposed to like trick you and
Hmm.
lead you towards something
Yes.
evil and so that trickery. I bring that up because I wonder if what's at work is, was it Vincent Pascal, the victim, or Victor Pascal,
Victor
the
Pascal. Yeah.
Victor. And I wonder if it begins there, but it's the work of the Wendigo starting to get into the minds and the psyches and the fears of this family. And I
That was
wonder,
my theory.
yeah, it's doing it
Yeah.
to Rachel, because
Yep.
don't forget, when we finally, Rachel has this really, it's a really scary, like one of those scares that makes you kind of giggle, when she suddenly sees Zelda in seeming real life hunched in the room, saying that she's going to twist her back so she can never walk again, and runs up to the camera.
Yeah.
But then Zelda morphs into Gage
Yeah.
and is
That.
wearing the same clothes, right? Like there's like a right, like is wearing the dress,
Yeah.
which
The
is such a
funeral
beautiful,
garb.
scary, yeah, and it's so, but matches, right? Like matches Zelda in a way, and it's when Rachel finally sees Gage and learns of what has happened. It doesn't last long.
And she
Um,
knows something's wrong. She clearly knows something's wrong.
totally, but she can't help.
He's holding up
Yeah, a
a
scalpel.
blade to her,
Yeah,
and she still goes and hugs him. And I
from
think that
yeah,
says everything about grief and what her perception of death and
yeah.
grief can be. Yeah,
And what he
it's a
does to her is really gnarly.
oh
It's
my
really
gosh, so
awful. And
gnarly.
it's that I remember shocking me as a kid. I shouldn't have been shocked though, because a movie that would kill a child in that way and bring back a child and then have the father have to kill him again. I shouldn't be surprised that it has, we throw around the phrase twist ending a lot.
Mhm.
And this is like not really a twist because we know what's gonna
We
happen,
know where it's going
like
from the beginning.
we know exactly what's gonna happen and what he's gonna do, and yet that final shot is so stressful and scary, but he knows what's going to happen. He, like it's the only way he can, like he can't live with himself, so he has to do what he does in the end. So I say this all to mean that I think that what might not be spelled out enough or clearly enough to us, but I think is maybe one of the intentions of the film, and if not, is certainly a fair reading of it, is that this Wendigo or whatever else is orchestrating this, is working its way in and predetermining what's going to happen, and that includes messing with Rachel's head and
Yeah.
calling on, and maybe that's partially why she remembers things the way she does, because
Yeah.
it's being
It's being
enlarged in her
twisted
mind, it's
by
being
something
twisted,
else.
because when she sees her, it is like it's not a memory. We're supposed to believe that it's really happening in front of her, and then transforming and switching to Gage. And so it's like, so what we're being told is that Gage is shapeshifting, right? Like he's
Yep.
pretending to be Zelda and then is Gage.
Yeah.
And that is a separate, that shape shifting is certainly part of that mythology, right? Or at least
Yeah.
one of the mythologies of, indigenous people, that is, maybe or certainly exploited for the sake of the story. and maybe that's one of the things the prequel wants to get right, and maybe wants to do, and maybe that's why we're
Okay.
getting a prequel, because it
Well,
might do some of that work. I don't know.
we'll see.
Um,
I would go
yeah.
so far regarding Victor Pascow, the
Yes.
runner who gets killed at the beginning and turns into a ghost. I would actually argue, and this is something that I thought about last night for the first time, that it's never the ghost of Victor Pascow that visits anybody in the family.
Yeah.
When Victor first appears to Lewis Creed after the death of Gage, he says, "Don't go into the pet cemetery, don't go into the burial ground back there." And what do we do when we're told not to do something?
Right.
Like Lewis may have just let it go if Victor didn't show up and say, "Don't go and do this."
Right.
And from there on, like he continues to sort of say, "Don't do it, Lewis." He appears in the graveyard, "Don't do it, Lewis." And even at the very end, where Lewis is bringing the corpse of his wife across the street in a shroud, Judd Crandall's house ablaze behind him, the ghost of Victor Pascow appears in the road and says, "Don't do it." Again, just putting the idea
Yeah.
in that it's a possibility. I'm like, that never struck me before as a
Yeah.
possibility that Victor Pascow was the entity or was an avatar of this sour ground out beyond the pet cemetery in the first place. I don't know.
The way you phrase it is so interesting and makes a lot of sense, and makes it pretty smart, because it's not trying to seduce or entice. It's rather working reverse psychology and saying, don't do it, but he's not listening. But then I wonder about something that the first real scare of the movie for me is when Judd is telling the story about the family who has the son who
Mm.
dies, and then when he comes back, not the same. That scene is very, very scary, with him
Oh my
coming in,
God.
and like
He's
it's one of
gnawing
those.
on a child's
Yeah,
leg,
it's
like a
so
severed
scary,
leg.
and yeah, it's really horrific, and it's very, there's something about the, like, I don't know, there's something about the sort of choreography of that moment that also stayed with me, and was, Judd telling that story as a warning, but Judd is the one who told him about it to begin with. So again, it's another thing was like, Judd, what are you doing? Like, why? Like, what is it in you
Yeah.
that is even bothering to like tell him and
Well,
show
he
him where, right?
he
Because he
has that
helps him with
he has
church,
that
like.
moment after the funeral. Judd sits down with Lewis and says, "I think this place worked through me to tell you about it." Judd takes
Mhm.
responsibility for that himself. And so I think you're absolutely right.
It's like taking responsibility is noble, but it doesn't change the fact that there was something in him that compelled him to do it to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to wonder about, to what degree is Judd vulnerable to, not that he purposely wanted to see this happen. He certainly didn't want what happened to himself to happen. And but it's like, again, are we sort of like, if we say that everybody is sort of a puppet for this larger, darker force, then maybe in some ways we can sort of ascribe that to Judd as well, for even
Mhm.
opening his mouth about it,
Oh yeah,
right?
I think so. I
Um,
really do. It
yeah.
it makes me think about this issue of the Micmac burial ground, the Indian burial ground trope that
Hmm.
was very popular once upon a time
Yes.
from white storytellers, now seen as very problematic.
Yeah.
I think the book handles it differently. I think what you're talking about, the Wendigo and all that stuff, the actual folklore is mentioned, but it's not mentioned in the movie. How it's handled in the movie is that there's a place far beyond the local pet cemetery where the children buried their dogs and cats that were taken
Hmm.
by the road, the heavy truck bearing road. And they go beyond this great big barrier of fallen trees and branches, which is an image that has always stuck in my head, as much as the violence that happens against Judd Crandall, as much as
Yeah.
the images of Zelda as a character. That barrier, impossibly large. I don't even know who or what could have stacked that there over time, but it's almost like the town has had some kind of dedicated person to make sure that that wall always stays there. Like the
Yeah.
people in the
Yeah.
town know that this is a bad place and make it very difficult for you to get over that barrier towards the very long hike to the Micmac burial ground.
Right.
And I appreciate that the character of Judd says, the Micmacs stopped using this area a long time ago once they realized what it could do, what it was doing. So it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily put the onus on the Native Americans. It puts something else there. It makes me think of the larger Stephen King universe where, the Dark Tower, there's many worlds, there's other worlds
Yeah.
than these, and this place could be seen in King terms as a thinny, and a place where demons or spirits or something from some unknown cosmic horror place that exists in Stephen King's imagination could come through. They need a host. They trying to get those bodies buried there, and that is what is reaching out to the family, to Judd, to other people in town who've had these experiences in this sour ground, as
Yeah.
Judd puts it. So, in a way, I do feel like the film handles it pretty well. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
blame or use a kind of a curse
It doesn't
trope.
over-explain
Yeah, it
either.
doesn't
Yeah.
over explain either. And I'm not going to be the white guy who's saying, like, oh, the trope isn't problematic because of this. But
Right. Right.
that's just what I saw in the rewatch of it. And I think that it sort of like touches back to everything that you were just saying, like something reaching out from the other side. These families are living very close to the prototypical bad place, which is a
Yeah.
thing that exists in horror fiction through
Right.
time eternal. And every single person in this family is touched by it. Church, the cat, is touched by it. Judd is touched by it. Rachel is influenced. Who even knows if, like, we don't really get a perspective from Gage, but Gage as a child maybe he was continuously lured out into that street. Like there was some
Right.
fascination with the road
Right.
and him.
Right.
And yes, keep your eyes on your children, but also, like, why is that child so fascinated with running into that
Yeah.
road?
Yeah.
Um, the,
Absolutely.
the other person I we haven't really even discussed is the daughter, Gage's
Right.
sister Ellie, and another sort of characteristic of King's fiction is the psychic child, and
Right.
how she
Right.
starts getting glimpses and visions of, Daddy, I had a dream that Church, my cat, died. Is Church okay? And then after the funeral, and she's
Yeah.
out staying with her grandparents in Chicago, she calls and says, I had a really bad dream about Mommy. Is Mommy okay? And it's an interesting kind of thing that's happening to Ellie. And in a
Mm-hmm.
way, I think it might be the worst thing that happens to any of the characters in this
Oh
in
yeah.
this movie, is that this little girl, 7 years old, clearly being touched by some dark force, that bad place.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I don't think it's in the movie. It's definitely not in the movie, but I remember a scene in the book where she ends up stark raving mad. And that messed me up. Like, this little
Yeah.
girl will never be okay. And I think that is one of the most powerful and horrific parts of the book, despite every bad thing that everybody ends up doing in this film, this story. Ellie is this victim that
Totally.
will never be the same, and possibly possessed in some way by this thinny, this sour ground that her family just happened to live next to.
I'm kind of surprised because King goes back to his own worlds often that I mean, he could still do it, who knows, but it would be fascinating to have an adult version of her and get a sequel that way, if it's possible.
Doctor Sleep style.
Yeah, but maybe better than Doctor Sleep.
I liked
Where-
Doctor Sleep. I actually liked the
I
movie. I liked the movie a lot.
I mean, I guess I didn't finish the book because I wasn't enjoying it, and I saw the movie. My husband fell asleep during it, and he was give me. I tried to wake him up. He's like, "Don't bother. I'm not waking up for this," because he really didn't like it. And I thought it was this might be controversial. I don't enjoy Mike Flanagan's work. I think it's all too sweet, and I think that that's the problem. And if it maybe in somebody else's hands with the same script, maybe I would have been a little more into it. Like I felt like it was missing some of the. I can see why people enjoy it, and I think it's a great adaptation of a difficult book.
Yeah, I do.
But
I do like Mike. I do like Mike Flanagan a lot.
yeah, I think there's a certain type of, I can see that you would really connect with Mike Flanagan's work, because I think that there's also a sweetness to the way you write scary stuff, and who it's for, who it's intended for. And so I think that there's some of that to him. I haven't like not enjoyed everything he's done, but I've definitely enjoyed much of The Haunting of Hill House. I think I liked Bly Manor more, actually. I think it like
Bly Manor blew me away. Bly Manor
it's really, people don't
made
seem to
me
like it as
weep.
much, but I really liked it.
Bly
Yeah, I really
Manor was
liked
an
it.
emotional roller coaster for me, and I don't
Yeah.
think I've cried as hard at the end of a television show as I have
Wow.
watching that. So like that's why I appreciate Mike
I liked him
Flanagan's
much
work.
more than Hill House. Yeah, so that would be interesting to maybe return to that character in some way. But I also wanted to go back a bit to what you were saying about how everybody in the town knows what's up. And again, it's why it makes what Judd does like a little confounding. And like, I actually want to reread the book now that we're having the conversation, because I'm curious about, because it's been so long since I read it, but I'm curious about how King sort of handles the implication that it has to be the Creed family this happens to, because they are new and they are right. And so as a result, when
They're
you are a
vulnerable.
you're vulnerable, you're a know nothing, and you are curious, and then tested in this horrible way, he fails, right? Because he can't tell his daughter that the cat has died. He has to do this other, and it's so
Yeah.
ridiculous, but like this moment of weakness is what opens the floodgates for this unimaginable horror.
And
Um,
it reflects his wife's inability to talk about grief or process her own grief.
right,
It's this whole
right,
movie is about this. Yeah.
totally, absolutely, and because that entity knows, well, look what he did with the cat. That means he will do this for every family member that that we take. And I think that is his weakness gets exploited in such a uh, profound way, but it has to be this new family. It can't
Yeah.
be. So it's what makes Judd's actions even like a little more accidentally villainous or something, or like
Sure.
dumb, or makes him stupid. Like, why did you do that? Like,
Yeah.
you didn't, why did you even have this conversation? Why did you ever tell him about this? Like, why did you, what's funny about the remake, and maybe you've read, it sounds like you've read the book more recently or
I
have a
listened
good
to the
memory of it.
audiobook. I listened to the audiobook a couple years ago. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I should listen to the audiobook. Maybe
Oh,
that would be a
Thomas.
more fun
What's his name?
experience.
Thomas C. Hall. No, the guy who played Dexter.
Oh, Michael C. Hall reads it.
Michael C. Hall reads
Oh,
it.
that
He's
okay, that's great.
fantastic.
I'm definitely gonna listen to it then.
Yeah.
That's a perfect way to listen to. Yeah, he would have been really good in the remake
Oh yeah.
as the dad.
He would have been good
But
Lewis.
he would have been really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in the movie, the remake, Rachel and Ellie see the little kids with the animal masks,
Yeah.
like playing the drums and going to do like a. And so I was like, I don't know if the book. I don't remember if the book has that image,
No,
but
it
it
does
doesn't.
not.
But it actually totally contradicts what you and I are saying about the town,
Hmm.
because if those kids, the implication is that they are going and doing this like service to go
Celebration.
bury
Yeah.
an animal. It's like, well, that means that people are doing this actively in the town, and that doesn't make sense. So another reason to throw the remake on the. Although one thing I do want to say about the remake, that even though I don't think it's very good, one thing that it does account for is what we were saying about Ellie. Although it
It
spoiler alert,
changes.
anybody hasn't
It.
seen it,
Yeah.
it changes. It makes Ellie the one who dies. She gets hit by the car going to get her cat. I keep calling it a car. It's a giant truck. She gets
Giant truck.
she gets pulverized by the truck, and they swap. And at first, I was like, "Well, is this a wimpy move? Are they doing it because they don't want to kill the little boy again, or is it like a cheap shock to just, or like a cheap way to say we're different because we have swapped the
Hmm.
children?" I think that the defense, both of Stephen King, who liked it, and the directors, was you can do more with an older girl,
Hmm.
which doesn't really, I mean, sort of, yeah, because Miko Hughes was so cute.
Oh my
And
God.
then it
We
goes
have to
on.
talk. We have to talk a little bit about him. But
Yeah, we have to
yeah,
talk.
go
He's
ahead.
incredible in it. He's so good, and it seems like he was just like a born actor, and like he did all that stuff like as soon as they asked him. And there's a lot of things I can't get my son to do, and I certainly, he probably would not listen to me to act in a movie at 3 years old. So they thought swapping the kids would give them more bandwidth to do more horrific stuff,
Yeah.
and I guess I could see that. And she obviously has much more dialogue and is like more directly antagonistic to her parents. And
Mhm.
because Rachel finds out that this has happened and interacts with her so much more in this movie than, than happens in the original film, it creates a different dynamic. But what the movie accounts for is the constant killing of family members to bury them, to bring them back.
Mhm.
And the last scene is
Yes.
Gage alone in the locked car, because he was put there for safekeeping, and the resurrected mom, dad, and sister are
Are
approaching
coming
for
for
him
him.
to bring him to. And in some ways it's like, well, then that's a happy ending, right? Because Gage doesn't have to like live with the idea that he is, like child, like he,
Yes.
he's orphaned and alone. And so
Parentless, yeah.
instead they're going to kill him too and bury him, and then the family's all together. So in some ways
But they're not
they're not
like what I said,
themselves.
they're not
Right.
themselves. They are possessed
Totally.
by some demon from the
Totally.
other
It's
worlds.
awful,
and
but
and
yeah.
that's and I think like that's what works for me in the remake,
Yeah.
is that it sort of points to, why is all of this happening? It's not just for
Right.
chaos. It's because something wants out.
Mm,
And this is how they get out. They need the bodies there, and that's how they get out.
yeah. That makes sense.
Um, but going back to
Miko, yeah.
Michael
Miko, I think.
Hughes, Miko Hughes as Gage. I think he was 2 years old or 3 years old when he
Yeah.
filmed this, and
Brilliant.
I just want to, like, before we wrap up, which we're
We'll
we're
have to
going a little bit
eventually.
long,
Yeah.
which is fine. I mean, I could keep
Yeah.
talking
Me
to you
too.
about stuff like this forever.
We'll do it again. We'll do it again.
Yeah, but Gage is one of the things that I remembered as a
Yeah.
kid watching this movie. His performance, the way that he delivers lines, they struck me as so funny, and I think they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like, just this baby, barely able to form sentences, saying things to his father like, "First I played with Judd, then I played with Mommy. Next, I'm going to play with you." And that's how he says it.
I
And he says it again once his dad goes into the house. He's like, "I'm going to play with
can I can
you."
I
And I'm
can I
like, that
tell
is
you
so
can I tell
creepy.
you that it might have to do with being a dad to a 3-year-old, but I actually cry. I cried when I rewatched it, and he gets stuck in the neck and he says, "No fair,
uh,
no
no
fair," and he's
fair.
walking and he's like
And
starting to stumble.
he's got that
It's
scowl on his
it
face,
is
that like little like
I'm
pouty
so yeah,
scowl. It's
and his voice,
incredible.
that moment, I got chills just saying it. Like the no fair,
Yeah.
it actually like breaks my heart, and it's such a, to me that's the most emotional moment in the whole movie, because he has to put him down basically like an animal in the pet cemetery, like
Mm.
and it's so
And then the scene where they show Lewis pours lighter fluid or gasoline all over Judd's
yeah,
house, and there's a scene where it races up the stairs and engulfs Gage's
yeah,
body. And I sat there like
yeah,
hugging
yep,
myself, because I was like, that is so messed up
yep,
to see. I can't believe I watched this as a
yeah,
child,
same.
and that didn't bother me.
Yeah,
That part didn't bother me. I
because
was
by the
like,
end you're
okay,
so
yeah,
in on it that it's not right,
oh
like, and
my
that's
god,
that's one of the
yeah,
tricks of horror movies, right? Like once you are inducted into the world of whatever this movie is doing, you go with it, and then you settle, you adapt to it, so like
mhm.
we adapted to it. And also it's like Gage is like Chucky-esque, so it's like, yeah, get that kid down. But
Get that kid,
30
but
30
he's a
years later you're
yeah.
like the no fair, like it literally made me cry, so
Oh my god,
so
wow.
I we're different people when we watch the movie stays the same technically, right? It's something I teach my students. We read this piece by Matthew Gulish called Criticism, and the whole, there are many ideas in the piece, but one of them is that art never changes, you change. So a critic might
Mm,
think a movie is the worst movie they've ever seen, but that criticism is not going to make the movie any better, right? Because that person will never see it as anything other than something they don't like. But if we can accept that everything is perfect, at least in part, even if you don't like it, there's some part of it that is a perfect thing, you can change your
mhm.
mind about how you watch it. And so I think about it in like certainly in relationship to horror movies, that something that you loved when you were 9, you can see it at 40 and think, wow, this is so poorly made. It's so shitty. It's I can't believe that here I am trying to be a screenwriter, trying to write horror movies, and people are making, made this, or you swap and you think, I really didn't like that, but I watch it in retrospect, or I laughed at that. I laughed at that Gage moment because we're in that child's play mindset from the year before, and that's what horror movies are doing. It's a killer baby, and it's like, but now as a 40-year-old dad, I changed, so what I'm seeing in front of me has changed. And so I think that's exactly what we're talking about right now, and that's true. Like, we didn't think it was a big deal then as kids, but now it's like really quite disturbing. The imagery is, and the world changes, so the context of everything changes.
It's incredible what looking back at something that affected you as a child, looking back as an adult and seeing that difference. You just said it better than I'm trying to say it right now. But it was really remarkable to put myself in that situation and watching this movie again, because I was like, I'll continue. I'll probably check in with Pet Sematary, every now and again. And I actually don't know if I ever need to watch this again.
Yeah. I don't know if I need to.
It was that disturbing to me.
I don't know if I need to either. But I am, because of this conversation, I really want to read or listen to it again.
Listen to the audiobook. It's fantastic. There's writing in there from King that, as you know, really has nothing to do with anything we've spoken about yet, but it is some of the scariest writing he's ever written, in my opinion. And it's the scene where Judd first brings Lewis out in the middle of the night to that burial ground, to the sour ground. And it's just atmospheric, the things that he hears, the things that they see. It's so scary to me. And I think that as a book, reading that book as a young kid has affected me and definitely influenced my writing as I've sort of become a professional. But Joey, I know I just want to sort of thank you for coming and being here, but I also wanted to ask you, finish up with a question. Do you agree, yes or no? Sometimes dead is better.
A resounding yes.
Sometimes. No, always.
always.
At least when it comes to the Pet
in the
Sematary.
Context of the Pet Sematary, that's an absolute. Yeah. No, this was so much fun. Thank you for having me. And I love an occasion to talk about all things horror, but this is a much different conversation that I would have had about this movie if somebody sat me down and said, hey, can you talk about this, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the things that I would have cared about and would have said, because those Zelda is what scared me so intensely as a kid. It's not what I'm compelled to talk about now. And I hadn't even thought about but I'm glad we did, because I hadn't thought about the notion of Rachel as an unreliable narrator and sort of the way she makes the memory of her sister monstrous, and that maybe there is something else that's doing that for her with her reason. I didn't even think about that. Even when I was rewatching it, it was maybe on the tip of my brain tongue, but I wasn't going in thinking that we would discuss it. And I think it was one of the more interesting parts.
I would like to give Stephen King the credit where credit is due, and maybe like we discussed, he picked an illness that he thought sounded scary, or maybe he picked an illness and then described the illness completely incorrectly on purpose.
There you go.
Like, I don't know, Mr. King, but props to you.
Maybe he comes from a don't do much research. I had a professor when I got my MFA, a very, very famous writer who now is gone. And he was like, do a little research, but don't do too much. And he was like really adamant that you don't have to write what you know, but you should have a basic understanding of what you're saying, but don't do too much research, because then it will really dilute your imagination. And maybe that's just where he was coming from.
I do remember something from his book on writing.
That's a great book,
where he says it's an incredible primer and memoir, but he says something regarding research is write the story first. If you don't know what you're talking about, write the story first, get it down, and then go back and do the research and fix it. And I do remember him saying that. So
His advice to his younger self, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Well, listen, Joey, thank you so much for coming, and please come back again.
Thanks so much, Dan. I will.
Well, that was fun. A conversation that went to places I totally didn't expect. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. A confession, though. This is the second outro I'm recording, and I'll tell you why. As I listened back to our chat, I got nervous about some of our criticism of artists and writers who are currently working hard and throwing passion into their projects. And my instinct was to come in at the end and apologize, just in case they somehow stumble upon this podcast out in the world, as people do. But I realize now that these talks should stand on their own, and with due respect to everyone involved, including my guests, their opinions are valid and worth sharing, even if I don't necessarily agree. Because what's the point of a chat if everyone is always on the same page? These are lessons I'm learning as I go. Hence, this second version of a goodbye to you, dear listeners. Seriously, though, thank you so much to my guest, Joe Vallese. His anthology, It Came From the Closet, is really wonderful. Again, please go get a copy if you haven't read it yet. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like, you can follow our social media at Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What's the worst animal one could bury up in the sour ground beyond King's Pet Cemetery? Giant squid, maybe? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.